The Kato house stood at the edge of the neighborhood like a pause in a sentence no one wanted to finish. It was an ordinary structure, 2 stories, pale walls, a narrow yard, but even before the murders, people walked faster when passing it, as if the air around it demanded silence. On the night the Kato family died, winter pressed itself against the windows, and the house absorbed every sound, every breath, every final moment, without giving anything back. The night did not announce itself as anything unusual at first. It arrived the way all nights did in that neighborhood, quietly, with the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog carried by the cold air. Lights blinked on behind curtains, televisions murmured, dinners were cleared away. Yet as the hours slipped past midnight, the Kato house refused to settle into sleep. Its windows glowed longer than they should have, a pale, watchful light that seemed to pulse rather than shine. Neighbors would later struggle to remember when they first noticed something was wrong, because the unease did not strike all at once, it crept in slowly, like a thought that keeps returning no matter how hard you try to push it aside. From the street, the house looked awake. Not lively, not welcoming, but alert. A shadow crossed the second-floor window more than once, tall and distorted, stretching and shrinking in a way that made it hard to tell whether it belonged to one person or many. At some point, a muffled sound slipped through the walls, something between a thud and a cry, softened by insulation and winter air. It was not loud enough to be unmistakable, not clear enough to demand action. Curtains shifted as neighbors peered out, then fell back into place. Each witness told themselves the same thing: families make noise, houses settle, imagination fills in the gaps when darkness takes over. Time, however, behaved strangely that night. Hours seemed to stall around the Kato house, as if the clocks inside were moving at a different pace from the rest of the street. A porch light flicked on and off again, too deliberate to be faulty. Later, the faint glow of the kitchen light appeared, even though the family should have been asleep. One neighbor, returning late from work, slowed his car as he passed, unsettled by the sense that he was intruding on something private and ongoing. He would later recall the feeling that the house was holding its breath, waiting for him to move on before continuing whatever it was doing. The cold deepened, pressing frost against the windows, but no one inside the Kato house opened a curtain or stepped outside. The usual sounds of a family settling for the night, laughter, conversation, the scrape of chairs, were absent. Instead, there was an intermittent stillness punctuated by noises that did not repeat themselves enough to form a pattern. A dull impact from one room, silence, then something dragged across the floor above. Each sound arrived alone, isolated, easy to explain away when considered on its own, impossible to assemble into a clear picture. Fear did not grip the neighborhood in a dramatic way. It lingered as hesitation. Phones remained on their hooks. Windows stayed shut. The idea of calling the police hovered at the edge of thought, then retreated, dismissed as overreaction. People trusted routine more than instinct. The Kato family had lived there quietly, without incident, and quiet families were assumed to be safe families. Whatever was happening inside that house, it was easier to believe it would resolve itself by morning. But the night stretched on, uncooperative and heavy. At around 3, a neighbor awoke to the sound of movement outside, a faint crunch of footsteps on frozen ground, followed by nothing. When she looked out, the street was empty, the Kato house dark now, its windows reflecting only her own light. Relief washed over her, brief and deceptive. Darkness meant sleep, meant normalcy returning. She went back to bed unaware that the silence was not the end of something, but the completion of it. Dawn arrived reluctantly, gray and thin. When the sun finally rose high enough to touch the Kato house, it revealed nothing out of place. No broken glass, no open doors, no sign of struggle visible from the outside. Yet the house felt wrong in daylight, heavier somehow, as though it had aged years in a single night. The absence of movement became noticeable then. No one left for work. No curtain shifted. The family's car remained parked, lightly dusted with frost that had not been disturbed. Concern replaced denial. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, speaking in low voices, replaying the fragments of the night before. The sounds they had dismissed now returned with sharper edges. Someone mentioned the lights. Another recalled the shadow. Each detail grew darker when spoken aloud, feeding off the others. When the police were finally called, it was not because of a single alarming event, but because the night, taken as a whole, refused to make sense anymore. By the time officers arrived and approached the front door, the night that had seemed endless was already receding into memory, but it left behind a residue that clung to everyone who stood there. The house, sealed and quiet, offered no answers, only the unsettling impression that what had happened inside had unfolded slowly, deliberately, over many hours, unnoticed not because it was invisible, but because it had relied on human hesitation to complete itself, stretching the darkness until it no longer needed to hide, allowing the night to pass not in chaos, but in the careful, methodical way something irreversible takes place while the world looks the other way and waits for morning to make it less real. The house did not resist the investigators when they entered, and that in itself felt wrong. The door opened smoothly, without splintered wood or bent metal, as though it had been unlocked willingly. Inside, the air was stale but not chaotic. There was no immediate sense of intrusion, no obvious sign that a violent crime had shattered the space. Shoes were lined neatly by the entrance. A coat hung where someone had left it earlier that evening. The quiet was so complete it felt staged, as if the house were presenting a version of itself carefully chosen to mislead. As officers moved room to room, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. The brutality of what had occurred clashed violently with the order of the surroundings. Furniture was largely undisturbed. Drawers were open, but not forced. There were marks of struggle, yes, but they appeared contained, deliberate, almost controlled. Bloodstains told a story of movement, yet they did not lead anywhere obvious. They crossed floors, climbed walls, then stopped, as though the violence itself had reached a boundary it could not pass. There was no shattered window to point to entry, no pried door frame to suggest escape. Every lock was intact. Every latch worked. The house seemed sealed, not just physically but conceptually, refusing to offer a beginning or an end. Investigators searched for the familiar markers of a crime scene, the kinds of details that usually shout for attention, and found instead a whispering absence. The lack of forced entry suggested familiarity, yet nothing in the family's history hinted at someone close enough to be trusted with that access. Footprints deepened the confusion. Some were clear, others smudged, overlapping in a way that suggested pacing rather than fleeing. They moved through the house with no urgency, circling back, retracing steps, lingering. This was not the path of someone desperate to escape. It was the route of someone unhurried, perhaps even curious. In certain rooms, the print stopped entirely, as if the person had stood still for a long time, listening, thinking, waiting. Even more disturbing were the signs that the intruder had remained after the murders were complete. Food had been taken from the kitchen and partially consumed. Packaging lay open, placed aside rather than discarded. A chair had been pulled out, then pushed back in. The television was on, volume muted, its flickering light frozen on a channel no one remembered choosing. These details unsettled seasoned officers more than the violence itself. They implied comfort, ownership, a sense that the house, at least for those hours, belonged to someone else. Time became a suspect of its own. Forensic estimates struggled to align with the evidence. Certain details suggested the crimes happened quickly, others pointed to long gaps between acts. It was as if the night had been stretched, folded over itself, made elastic by whatever occurred within those walls. The idea that someone could commit such acts and then linger, unnoticed, challenged everything investigators relied on to reconstruct events. Every potential exit was examined and re-examined. The windows offered no trace. The doors showed no sign of being opened after the murders. There were no clear tracks leading away from the house, no discarded clothing, no weapon abandoned in haste. The absence of a trail was so complete it felt intentional, as though the scene had been designed to deny pursuit. The killer had not merely escaped, they had erased the concept of escape altogether. As evidence was catalogued and photographed, a subtle shift took place among those inside the house. Voices lowered. Movement slowed. The space exerted a quiet pressure, making even routine procedures feel intrusive. Officers later admitted they felt watched, not in a supernatural sense, but in the unsettling way an occupied room feels after someone has just stepped out. The presence of the crime lingered, not as chaos, but as order held too tightly. The house offered too many details and not enough answers. Each piece of evidence contradicted another, forming a pattern that collapsed the moment anyone tried to define it. This was not a scene that revealed itself through careful examination, it resisted understanding, as if clarity itself were something that had been deliberately removed. The longer investigators stayed, the stronger the impression grew that the house was not hiding the truth, but holding it, keeping it suspended just out of reach, intact and untouchable, waiting for someone to make sense of a night that refused to explain itself. After the police sealed the house, the street expected relief to settle in, the way it usually does once something terrible is contained behind tape and official statements. Instead, an unease spread outward, slow and persistent. The Kato house stood closed and guarded, yet it no longer felt empty. Its windows reflected the sky during the day and swallowed the dark at night, but people passing by sensed a continuation rather than an ending. The crime was over, the danger supposedly gone, and still the atmosphere suggested an unfinished act, as if the house itself had not received the message that it was meant to fall silent. The first reports were easy to dismiss. A patrol officer noted that a light appeared to be on inside after the house had been locked for the evening. He assumed it was a reflection, a trick of glass and street lamps, and wrote nothing down. Another night, a neighbor swore she smelled food cooking, faint but unmistakable, drifting from the direction of the empty house. Grief does strange things to perception, people said. Shock lingers. The mind looks for patterns where none exist. The explanations worked, until they didn't. Keys were checked and rechecked. Locks were verified. The house remained sealed, yet signs of activity accumulated in quiet, unnerving ways. The trash bin outside was heavier than it should have been, containing food packaging that had not been there before. Inside, when officers conducted routine inspections, objects were found in slightly different positions than they had been left. A chair angled toward the television. A door not fully closed. None of it dramatic enough to trigger alarms, but together they formed a suggestion that was impossible to ignore. What troubled the investigators most was not the idea that someone had broken in, but the absence of any evidence showing how. There were still no forced entries, no compromised windows, no disturbed seals. The house seemed to function like a closed system, allowing movement without allowing passage. The notion crept in quietly, unspoken but shared, that whatever remained inside did not need to enter or leave in any conventional sense. It was simply there, occupying the space the way a memory occupies a thought. Neighbors began to alter their routines. Children were kept indoors. Curtains were drawn earlier in the evening. People crossed the street rather than walk past the house. At night, sounds carried farther than they should have. Footsteps echoed where no one stood. A low hum, like electricity running through walls, seemed to emanate from the structure itself. The house was no longer just the site of a crime, it had become a participant in the aftermath. Officers assigned to monitor the property experienced a growing discomfort they struggled to articulate. Long hours spent parked outside produced a sense of being observed, not aggressively, but attentively. More than one reported the feeling that the house responded to their presence, settling when they arrived, growing restless when they left. Radios crackled unexpectedly. Watches lost time. These details were laughed off in reports, reduced to coincidences, but among themselves, the officers spoke carefully, choosing words that avoided the implications they all felt pressing in. Attempts were made to explain the disturbances through rational means. Faulty wiring could account for lights. Animals could account for sounds. Human error could explain moved objects. Each theory worked in isolation and failed in combination. The activity was too consistent to be random, too subtle to be confrontational. It suggested intention without motive, presence without identity. The house was not demanding attention, it was assuming it. As weeks passed, the sealed rooms seemed to grow heavier with what they contained. The air inside felt stale even when windows were briefly opened during inspections. The temperature was uneven, certain areas colder than others, as though the house remembered the night it had held and refused to warm entirely. The idea that the killer had stayed after the murders evolved into something more unsettling, that staying had never truly ended. rumors took on lives of their own. Some claimed the case files were incomplete, that information was being withheld. Others whispered that the house itself was evidence, that it had absorbed something during the crime that could not be removed. People spoke of the Kato family in the present tense, then corrected themselves quickly, embarrassed by the slip. The line between memory and presence blurred, reinforced by a house that refused to behave like an empty shell. Eventually, official attention waned. Cases demanded resources. Time moved on. Yet the Kato house remained unchanged, a fixed point in a neighborhood trying to forget. The disturbances did not escalate, but they did not stop. They settled into a pattern of quiet reminders, small enough to deny, persistent enough to endure. Anyone who stood too close for too long felt it, a subtle pressure, like standing just outside a room where someone was waiting, listening, unhurried, confident that there was no need to leave because the house already knew how to keep what it had been given. The investigation surged forward briefly, propelled by the stubborn refusal to accept that a crime so meticulous could leave nothing behind. For a time, it seemed as though the case was finally yielding to logic. A fragment of evidence emerged that felt tangible, almost reassuring in its normalcy. A partial print, not clear enough to identify but distinct enough to suggest a human source rather than chance. Fibers that did not match anything in the house. A vague sighting reported days late by someone who had been afraid to speak earlier. These pieces hinted at a suspect who existed just long enough to be imagined. Detectives built a profile carefully, layering assumption upon inference. The intruder was methodical, patient, comfortable in confined spaces. Familiar enough with the neighborhood to move unnoticed, yet distant enough from the family to leave no emotional trace behind. The theory made sense, perhaps because it needed to. It offered a version of events that restored balance, that returned the crime to the realm of human behavior rather than something harder to confront. For a brief moment, it felt as though the case had a direction again. Then the evidence began to thin. The partial print degraded under closer analysis, its distinguishing features blurring into uncertainty. The fibers, once promising, turned out to be common, their origin impossible to narrow down. The late sighting conflicted with other timelines and was quietly set aside. Each step forward collapsed into a step back, not dramatically, but gradually, like ground giving way beneath careful feet. Records were reviewed and revised. Timelines shifted by minutes, then hours. What had seemed like a narrow window for escape expanded, then vanished entirely. The suspect who had begun to take shape dissolved under scrutiny, reduced to a collection of traits shared by countless others. No one could be ruled in, but no one could be ruled out either. The investigation stopped chasing a person and started circling a void. The case resisted closure in ways that frustrated even the most seasoned investigators. Leads arrived unexpectedly and led nowhere. Anonymous tips contradicted one another. Names surfaced and disappeared. Every time a thread appeared solid enough to follow, it unraveled in the hands of those who tried to hold it. The sense grew that the case was not merely unsolved, but actively refusing to be solved, shedding conclusions as quickly as they formed. The psychological toll mounted quietly. Detectives found themselves rereading reports late into the night, searching for patterns they had missed. Small details took on outsized significance, only to collapse under analysis. Dreams blurred with evidence photos. The house, though no longer central to daily operations, remained a presence in their thoughts, an anchor point they could not drift too far from without feeling they were abandoning something unfinished. Administrative pressures added another layer of erosion. Resources were finite. New cases demanded attention. The longer the Kato investigation remained unresolved, the harder it became to justify the time it consumed. Files grew thicker without growing clearer. Eventually, the case was reclassified, not officially closed, but quietly sidelined. The transition happened without ceremony, a procedural adjustment that felt heavier than any formal announcement. Public interest waned, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher fears. The story of the Kato family faded from headlines into local memory, mentioned only in passing, often with inaccuracies that blurred fact and rumor together. What remained consistent was the lack of resolution. The absence of an answer became the defining feature of the case, shaping how it was remembered and how it haunted those who had been closest to it. As years passed, the investigation existed more as an archive than an active pursuit. Boxes of files were moved, reorganized, and eventually stored away. Each contained pieces that almost fit, narratives that nearly worked. The truth felt close enough to touch at times, then impossibly distant. There was no single mistake to correct, no overlooked clue that promised redemption. The trail had not ended in a dramatic dead end, it had simply thinned to nothing, leaving behind the unsettling realization that some crimes do not conclude with answers, but with silence, and that silence, once it settles, can be as deliberate and enduring as any act of violence itself. Years after the case slipped from active investigation into a quiet state of unresolved existence, the location of the Kato house became something people spoke about cautiously, as if the name itself might summon attention. The neighborhood changed around it, families moved in and out, children grew older, new houses were renovated and repainted, yet that property remained untouched, preserved in a way that felt less like respect and more like avoidance. The structure aged, but it did not decay naturally. It stood intact, watchful, as though time treated it differently from everything else on the street. Those who returned to the site after long absences described an immediate sensation upon approaching it, a subtle pressure that settled behind the eyes and in the chest. It was not fear in the conventional sense, not the sudden jolt of panic, but something quieter and heavier. People felt slowed, measured by the space they occupied, as though the house was aware of them long before they reached the gate. The closer they came, the more pronounced the sensation became, a feeling of being acknowledged rather than threatened. Urban explorers, drawn by the reputation of unsolved crimes and abandoned spaces, occasionally attempted to enter the property despite warnings. Most turned back before reaching the door, unsettled by the stillness that clung to the place. Those who did go inside rarely stayed long. They reported a profound disorientation, rooms feeling larger or smaller than they should have been, always seeming to extend beyond their actual length. Sound behaved strangely, footsteps echoing too loudly or not at all, as if the house were selectively responding to movement. More unsettling were the accounts of recognition. Visitors described moments where they felt expected, as though the house had anticipated them. Doors appeared slightly ajar in rooms they had not yet entered. Floorboards creaked ahead of them, not behind. In some cases, explorers swore they heard breathing that did not belong to anyone present. These stories circulated quietly, often shared with embarrassment, the speakers quick to emphasize they did not believe in anything supernatural, even as they struggled to explain why the experience had followed them home. Former investigators, returning years later out of personal obligation rather than professional duty, reported similar sensations. Standing outside the house stirred memories that felt less like recollection and more like re-entry. The case did not feel past, it felt paused. The house seemed to hold on to the version of them who had once stood there, younger, more certain, and now replaced by someone carrying unanswered questions. For some, it became clear that the unresolved nature of the case had attached itself to the location in a way that paperwork never could. The idea emerged gradually, not as a theory but as a shared impression, that the house remembered. Not in a metaphorical sense, but in a way that suggested accumulation. Every sound, every movement, every unanswered question appeared to have been absorbed into its structure. The walls did not simply enclose space, they contained experience. The house was no longer a passive backdrop to violence but an active archive, holding more than any official record ever had. People who lived nearby described moments when the house seemed to react to attention. When someone stopped to look at it for too long, a curtain might shift though no wind stirred. On particularly quiet nights, a light would flicker briefly, not enough to illuminate a room, just enough to acknowledge presence. These incidents were subtle, easily dismissed, yet they carried a consistency that made denial difficult. The house did not reach outward aggressively, it observed, patient and contained. Over time, the question of the killer's identity lost its sharpness, replaced by something more abstract and unsettling. The focus shifted from who had committed the crime to what had been left behind. The sense grew that the truth was no longer solely a matter of evidence but of place. Whatever answers existed were bound to the house itself, intertwined with its rooms and hallways in a way that made separation impossible. The Kato House became a boundary rather than a destination. People sensed that entering it was not about uncovering facts but about being absorbed into a narrative that had never concluded. Those who stood at its threshold often described the same instinctive reaction, a sudden certainty that the house did not want to be understood, only remembered, and that it watched not to threaten or invite, but to ensure that what it held would remain intact, undisturbed, waiting quietly in the shape of a home that had learned how to look back.